In this video, we will discuss the Vietnam War. It was a war fought to contain communism in Southeast Asia. It was a difficult and unpopular war that divided Americans. In the end, 58,000 Americans died, and South Vietnam would fall to communism. The United States got involved in the French Indochina War in 1950, when President Truman sent $15 million in aid to the French. This would leap to $1 billion a year and last through 6 presidencies: Truman, Eisenhower, JFK, LBJ, Nixon, and Ford. After World War II, the French moved their troops back into their former colony of Indochina. They controlled the South, while Minh controlled the North. Upon entering office, President Eisenhower used the domino theory to justify supporting the French in Indochina. The French were forced to surrender when they lost at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. At the Geneva Accords, Vietnam was divided into 2 countries along the 17th parallel. North Vietnam was communist and South Vietnam was backed by the US. Both sides agreed to hold elections to unify the country in 1956. The US decided to support the corrupt South Vietnamese government led by Ngo Dinh Diem. A communist rebel group in South Vietnam called the Viet Cong was formed, with the goal of overthrowing Diem and bringing communist rule to Vietnam. The communist North Vietnamese smuggled supplies to the Viet Cong through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. JFK sent 16,000 military advisors into South Vietnam, including the Green Berets. The US backed a military coup that assassinated Diem. Then President Lyndon B. Johnson will escalate the war in Vietnam. In 1964, the USS Maddox was patrolling along the North Vietnamese coast in the Gulf of Tonkin when a North Vietnamese patrol boat fired a torpedo at it and missed. Maddox returned fire and inflicted heavy damage. 2 days later, the USS Maddox and a destroyer reported being fired upon. Again, although no PT boat or torpedo was ever seen by either crew. LBJ used this provocation to convince Congress to grant him the power to use any and all military force necessary to prevent any further aggression. Lyndon Johnson failed to tell America that we had been secretly bombing North Vietnam and that the Maddox was collecting data for these raids. In 1965, he used his new powers under the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution to unleash Operation Rolling Thunder. By June of that year, more than 50,000 U.S. troops were fighting the Viet Cong. The Vietnam War was a conflict between the Viet Cong, supplied by the North Vietnamese, versus the ARVN and the US. While the US had superior weaponry, the Viet Cong had the terrain, jungle, and guerrilla warfare tactics working in their favor. The Viet Cong lived amongst the peasants in the villages, making it difficult to find the enemy. The Viet Cong also built a vast network of tunnels to withstand airstrikes and launch surprise attacks. Both sides laid numerous landmines, making walking through the jungle very dangerous. The United States employed 3 strategies that eventually would turn the peasants against the US. In an attempt to expose the Viet Cong tunnels and hideouts, we dropped napalm, a gasoline-based bomb that set fire to the jungle. We also sprayed Agent Orange, a leaf-killing toxic chemical. It destroyed the jungle and exposed thousands of people to a harmful chemical. In fact, Agent Orange is blamed for Vietnam veterans contracting cancer years later. US soldiers also conducted search and destroy missions, uprooting civilians with suspected ties to the Viet Cong, killing their livestock and burning their villages. By 1967, there were more than 3 million refugees in the South. Roy Benavidez first went to Vietnam in 1965 and received a severe wound that doctors said would keep him from ever walking again. Despite this diagnosis, Benavidez made a full recovery. He returned to Vietnam in 1968, where, armed only with a knife, he saved 8 men from a patrol that was surrounded by North Vietnamese soldiers. He had a total of 37 bullet, bayonet, and shrapnel wounds. In 1981, he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions during that battle in 1968. Since World War I, the United States has had a draft. All males had to register with their local draft boards when they turned 18. If you were between 18 and 26, you would be called into service into wartime. The only way to avoid service was for medical reasons or get a college deferment. You could put off service while you attend college. During the 1960s, most college students tended to be affluent and white. Most of the US soldiers fighting in the war were mainly poor or African American. This created a new movement against the war based on college campuses. One movement was called the New Left. They demanded sweeping changes in American society. One group of the New Left was Students for a Democratic Society. They called for the restoration of participatory democracy and greater individual freedoms. The second group came out of the University of California at Berkeley and was called the Free Speech Movement. They wanted free speech on campuses. Many men avoided the war by going to jail, moving to Canada, or injuring themselves. The country was divided into two camps. One group was against war, all war. They were known as Doves. Those Americans that were in favor of the war and using all of America's might were known as Hawks. The case of Tinker versus Des Moines involved 3 students who wore black armbands to school to protest the Vietnam War. After refusing to remove them, they were suspended by their school's administration. Appealing the decision, their case ultimately reached the Supreme Court. In a 7-2 decision, the court ruled in favor of the students' right to freedom of speech and expression. The Tinker test still requires that schools must have a compelling disciplinary reason for limiting students' freedom of speech or expression. The long debate over lowering the voting age in America from 21 to 18 began during World War II and intensified during the Vietnam War, when young men denied the right to vote were being conscripted to fight for their country. In the 1970 case Oregon versus Mitchell, a divided U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Congress had the right to regulate the minimum age in federal elections, but not at the state and local level. Amid increasing support for a constitutional amendment, Congress passed the 26th Amendment in March of 1971. The states promptly ratified it, and President Nixon signed it into law that July. The 26th Amendment lowers the voting age from 21 to 18. On the eve of Vietnamese New Year, known as Tet, the Viet Cong launched a surprise massive attack on every major South Vietnamese city and several U.S. bases. They even bombed the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, killing 5 Americans. It took about a month, but the Viet Cong were eventually put down. General Westmoreland tried to convince the U.S. public that the Tet Offensive was an overwhelming failure, but the public who witnessed most of the offensive on television did not believe him. This was known as the credibility gap, which ended up destroying the LBJ administration. The Viet Cong suffered 32,000 casualties, while the U.S. suffered only 3,000 losses, but the U.S. public couldn't shake the image of the U.S. Embassy being attacked. If the Viet Cong were so close to defeat, how is it possible they could manage a massive attack? The public no longer believed what the LBJ administration told them. In the wake of the Tet Offensive, President Johnson decides not to run for a second term. The credibility gap had eroded Johnson's popularity, with his approval rating at around 40%. The Vietnam War became the first war that civilians could view at home on a daily basis. Most Americans would sit down for dinner and watch the events of that day on their TVs. It became known as the Television War. The most trusted journalist of the Vietnam War was Walter Cronkite. Cronkite was a respected television journalist that reported the events of the war. In 1968, Cronkite criticized U.S. involvement in Vietnam, stating that there was no clear victory in sight. Many believe that this opinion was a major factor in influencing LBJ not to run for president again. With LBJ deciding not to run in 1968, the Democrats selected Hubert Humphrey, the current vice president, as their candidate. This angered anti-war Americans, and 10,000 of them descended on Chicago to protest the convention. Chicago's Mayor Daley was determined to keep the protesters under control. He mobilized 12,000 policemen and activated 5,000 National Guards. The police moved into the crowd and beat them with nightsticks. The nation watched on TV as the Democratic Party became the party of disunity. The Republican Party looked to benefit from the fighting in the Democratic Party. They selected former Vice President Richard Nixon, who defeated a young Ronald Reagan to win the nomination. Nixon ran on a campaign to restore law and order. He won the election 301 to 191 with only 43.2% of the popular vote. Third-party candidate George Wallace won 5 southern states that should have gone to Humphrey, helping Nixon secure the victory. Nixon's supporters were known as the silent majority. They were the older generation, blue-collar workers, and middle class that supported Vietnam. The My Lai massacre occurred on March 16, 1968. The public did not find out about it until November of 1969 by New York Times correspondent Seymour Hersh. He reported that a U.S. platoon led by Lieutenant William Calley Jr. were looking for Viet Cong in this northern South Vietnam village. When they couldn't find any, they ordered the village to gather in a circle and proceeded to mow them all down. Most were women, children, and elderly. Soldiers were unapologetic and coldly told their story. When asked about it, they said they were only following orders. Only Calley was convicted and imprisoned. On April 30th, 1970, even as U.S. troops were coming home, Nixon announced the invasion of Cambodia to stop Viet Cong supply lines. This led to the first nationwide student strike and protest. 1.5 million students shut down colleges across the country. Student protests against the war turned violent. The most famous was at Kent State. Students burned down the ROTC building to protest the war. The governor called out the National Guard. They fired live bullets on a group of students who were throwing rocks at them. 9 people were injured, 4 were killed, 2 of which were not even protesting. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. As similar events occurred across the country, Americans were divided. Many Americans sided with the National Guard, saying the students got what they deserved. The Pentagon Papers was the name given to a top-secret Department of Defense study of U.S. political and military involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967. As the Vietnam War dragged on with more than 500,000 U.S. troops, by 1968, military analyst Daniel Ellsberg sent a copy to the New York Times, which then published a series of articles based on the report's secrets. Some of the most unfavorable information in the Pentagon Papers indicate that the administration of John F. Kennedy actively helped overthrow and assassinate South Vietnamese President Diem in 1963. The report also revealed that the presidential administrations of Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson all had misled the public about the degree of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, from Truman's decision to give military aid to France during its struggle against the communist-led Viet Minh, to Johnson's development of plans to escalate the war in Vietnam as early as 1964, even as he claimed the opposite during that year's presidential election. Vietnamization was the strategy aimed to reduce American involvement in the Vietnam War by transferring all military responsibilities to South Vietnam. The increasingly unpopular war had created deep rifts in American society. President Nixon believed his Vietnamization strategy, which involved building up South Vietnam's armed forces and withdrawing U.S. troops, would prepare the South Vietnamese to act in their own defense against the North Vietnamese takeover, and allow the U.S. to leave Vietnam in honor. On January 27, 1973, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the U.S. signed the Paris Peace Accords, officially ending U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. The settlement included a ceasefire throughout Vietnam. The U.S. agreed to withdraw all troops and advisors and dismantle all bases within 60 days. In return, the North Vietnamese agreed to release all U.S. and other prisoners of war. North Vietnam also agreed to respect South Vietnam and not use force to reunify the country. Remember that under the U.S. Constitution, Congress has the power to declare war. Yet in 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave that power to the President. In 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Act to limit the President's war-making powers. It states that a President must notify Congress within 48 hours of sending troops into a hostile area. Also, the troops may remain there no longer than 90 days unless Congress approves the President's actions or declares war. The South Vietnamese capital of Saigon, now known as Ho Chi Minh City, fell to the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong on April 30, 1975. The South Vietnamese forces had collapsed under the rapid advancement of the North Vietnamese, which began in December of 1974. Despite previous presidential promises to provide aid in such a scenario, the U.S. did nothing. By this time, Nixon had resigned from office, and his successor, Gerald Ford, was unable to convince Congress to make good on Nixon's promises to rescue Saigon from communist takeover. Vietnam is unified under a communist government with its capital at Hanoi.